Thank you very much, Gemma. And we're going to pick up, I think, on a lot of the points that you've raised in our next panel.
Shall I go?
So, yep. So we'll get our next panelists out. We have Martin Schulz, professor at Stockholm University and founder of Juridikinstitutet. I mangled that, I know. Erik Jansson, the head of unit at the Swedish Social Insurance Inspectorate and secretary of the recently completed Swedish Parliamentary Privacy Committee. Joe Kanatachi, welcome back up onto the stage, and Leanne Colonna, who is also from Stockholm University, a researcher on all these matters. So, let's have a seat. Wherever you like. Okay, well, let me first pick up on something that Gemma said, which is she thinks the fundamental question that authorities should be asking is what makes people safe. And I think increasingly probably what it's actually focused on is what makes people feel that they're safe, this so-called security theatre. And I wonder, Martin, let me start with you and get your reactions to Gemma's take on that in the last presentation.
Well, I'm not sure I really have a reaction to that. I really enjoyed the presentation and I learned a lot and a lot of insights. I think maybe one general thing the only general thing I wanted to say today, actually, is that we have this discussion now on privacy, and especially in this context with safe cities, with security in general. And I think it's fruitful to start with a distinction from a legal perspective with two kinds of norms, two kinds of rules, basically. First, we have what we can call the first order rules, rules that protect privacy, rules, for instance, the right to privacy in a rights context, but also more specific rules. And then we have second order rules, rules that concerning responsibility and accountability that you can use. And we touched upon this here at the end of the presentation. And now all the emphasis is on the first order rules, data protection, and very little is what can you do when your privacy has been infringed? What can you do when you feel that either a private party but also the government has violated your rights? I think maybe to start things off, I think maybe we need to have a little bit more emphasis on the access to justice perspective, what you can do if your privacy has been infringed, because I think that can also improve the protection of privacy on the first order level. If people basically can sue the internet into a better place, we want people to take charge of their own privacy also on the responsibility level. And there we have, especially if we look at it from a Swedish perspective, nobody does this. Nobody sues anybody for infringements of privacy if you're not very rich or you're the government, sometimes from the prosecutor. So that's to start things off from my perspective.
Okay, well, let me turn then to the other side. And Leanne, what's your reaction?
I guess one thing that I just want to add is a little bit of the law enforcement perspective here. I understand there is this security theater, but at the same time, and maybe it's because I'm from New York and I was there on 9/11, or Stockholm here a few months ago when we've had attacks. There are very real threats, and I think if you think about law enforcement agencies and national intelligence surveillance agencies, they understand that terrorists are operating within our environments. They are online, and they have big problems. How do we locate these terrorist communications within this environment of where there's all these civilian communications that are completely lawful? Sometimes this is more colloquially referred to as the needle in the haystack problem. How do we filter out terrorist communications within this broad communications environment? And also, I think worth noting is that terrorists are really clever, and they mask their communications within this environment, and they use tools like encryption. And if you with 9/11, there was all the data there, but they didn't have the ability to connect the data. And so, I think that there is a very real and legitimate interest on behalf of the law enforcement agencies to be collecting large amounts of data. And in my research, I've really looked at, here in Sweden, we have the FRA law, and the Swedish government is collecting all of the communications that transfer across Swedish borders, and wow, that's a lot of data. Is that justified? And I think it goes back to what my colleague was saying here, that what we really need to see in the law is that do data subjects have proper rights to due process, basically. And I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Okay, Eric, it's often framed as a security versus privacy trade-off. Do you see it like that? Is that the right way to approach it? We always discuss it like that.
Yeah, probably not. No, I think that what really caught me in Gemma's in her speak was the point of not evaluating the effect, and the effect has to do with the effect for law enforcement and also for privacy. So in many cases, I think you would see that both things are not, wouldn't see great differences between them. And for instance, and I would like to take a Swedish example. The Swedish police authority, they're actually waiting to see the effect when it comes to predictive systems. They're studying the predictive, at least when I had contact with them for about a year ago, studied predictive policing in the US, and waited for good effects to show in those actually working systems. And they haven't really they haven't acquired such systems yet. But in Sweden, and I think also in other Nordic countries, those government authorities that work with the predictive systems are like the tax agency or the social insurance agency, for instance. And they try to, for instance, I work for the Swedish Social Insurance Inspectorate, and we've been tasked by government to make an evaluation of the profiling systems of the Swedish insurance agencies, the profiling system of it, how it works, and whether if it's legal or not. So. And that's a good example. I think our government is interested in both sides, in effectiveness and in privacy and lawfulness. So it actually, I think it often harms the discussion to divide it into either privacy or security or efficiency.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to immediately agree with the preceding speaker in saying I think it's a false dichotomy to talk about privacy versus security. You should have privacy in synergy with security. Unfortunately, you can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind. It's false also because it seems to suggest balance, so a little less security equals a little more privacy. That's pure undiluted rubbish, right? Secondly, I'd like to, express my concern about something you said, Leanne, because we don't have evidence that all the interceptions that the Swedish are carrying out on their data is either proportionate or necessary in a democratic society. And that, to me, is gravely worrying. You see, I think that Gemma, as usual, made a lot of sense, and she always makes sense when I'm speaking to her. So, what did Gemma say? She said the very sensible things that you and I would say, if we're going to spend our money, let's spend it wisely. If we have a hole in the roof, let's fix the hole in the roof and not take a pneumatic hammer and destroy the foundations of the house. Because it may not sound very glamorous to increase policing because that's what you need. But in actual effect, let's just think about it. You mentioned 9/11, right? So, it's a great tragedy. 9/11 was a great tragedy. And I've been to Ground Zero. And I've counted the number of people who died. In the 10 years that followed 9/11, more Americans died slipping in the bathtub, taken together, than they died in 9/11. Are we about to abolish the bathtub? And I think that if you look at statistics very carefully, you understand immediately how false it is to allow ourselves to permit interference with privacy just because the politicians are playing on the psychology of fear. Because that's the only thing that's happened. With all due respect, and this is because I'm easily the oldest person on the panel, right? So I have lived through the IRA in the UK, the Brigate Rosse in Italy, the Baader-Meinhof in Germany, and frankly, we are now at ridiculous levels on the creation of the psychology of fear. And what I think we should need to do is go out and educate the public and tell them, listen, forget all the crap that the politicians are trying to feed you in order to look good, in order to look as if they're doing something. Oh, look at me, I'm a politician, I'm doing something, but there's terror out there. Let's try and educate people in the right way, which is, hello folks, 5 people on average die in the UK every year because of terrorism. That's the figure for the past 10 years. 11 people die in the UK every year because of ladders. We are not about to ban ladders because 11 people die in the UK falling off ladders. Incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, we're not about to ban beds either because on average 10 people in the UK, that's twice the number killed by terrorists, die falling out of bed every year. We're in a ridiculous situation where we allow the governments to feed us crap and to frighten the bejesus out of people just because they can. And it's dumb. And if we are dumb enough to swallow their arguments, then I guess we deserve losing our privacy. Because quite frankly, all the surveillance on the planet is not going to protect me if some person who is mentally unhinged decides to take a knife made in Sweden or a Volvo designed in Sweden, if not actually built here, and run me down as I go down Maria Torget. So can we kindly get people to reason things logically rather than let fear rule our lives? And this is the appeal that I've made to the Human Rights Council in March of this year. And for Pete's sake, you know, can we breathe some sense into the whole discussion? Because, quite frankly, where's proportionality in all this? Where's the proportionality which shows me that all the interceptions carried out by the Swedish intelligence service and by the Swedish police are proportionate and necessary in a democratic society? Because that's the test, ladies and gentlemen. If they don't meet those tests, then they're against European law.
Well, I asked this similar question at RightsCon to the Belgian Deputy Prime Minister. I said, why is there this constant need for security authorities? They always want more data. You never hear them say, oh, we have enough. And I was really saying, tell me why they do this. And he said, it's because they have to cover their backs, because there is outrage after something like, you know, the recent terror attacks in Brussels. And they need to be able to say, point to the fact that we did everything we could. I mean, surely that is a sort of legitimate defense. Joe, you want to take that?
No, it's not a legitimate defense. It's simply, look at me, I'm a politician and I want to cover my ass. And I'm not a specialist in politicians' asses, but when it comes to trying to see how it goes, right? We're in the ridiculous position that in Belgium, I would have said, dear Prime Minister, mothers and fathers went to try and tell the police and the intelligence services that my son is being radicalized and is becoming a terrorist, and you did sweet FA. Now, please do something decent about that and leave my private data alone.
Okay, well, yeah, Martin.
I agree with most of the things you said here. The false dichotomy between security on the one hand and privacy on the other hand, I agree with that. Still, we do need to balance these interests, right? We need to balance the interest of the privacy of, for instance, a group of people that we fear might be radicalized on the one hand, because maybe they're not, and public interest on the other hand. And I think one of the problems is that we have this, when we do this balancing, we're balancing interests that are on completely different levels. We have the public interest of security and safety on the one hand, and we have individual interest on the one hand. So these are very small concerns for individual people. There's a general aspect of it as well. One example is the Roma registry we had here in Sweden, where the police registered a lot of people belonging to an ethnic minority. And one part of this was the legitimate concern that people belonging to this group, some of them did engage in criminal activities, but they also included kids. And of course, kids do not commit crimes. So then we get back to the balancing in question. How do we, in policy decision making, actually find a way to balance the general interest while also taking concerns of each and every individual interest in the case? Because that's a very difficult process. I mean, it would take a lot of concern. I mean, to look through all of these people if you want to look at a group. And I think so, to just say that privacy and security are not in conflict with each other, that I think it simplifies a little bit maybe the fact that we do need to make these assessments every once in a while. Not me, but policymakers here.
Eric, a comment.
I agree. But there's one thing I wanted to comment about, and that's this mass collection of data. The problem with it and makes it less interesting is that it's not very smart. But if you look at smart predictive systems and how they're actually used by governments today, often they're used to build a better society, not to put people in a situation where policing is not needed. For instance, making predictions about kids early on, about their health, about their learning, how to help them before they get in trouble. Also finding people on social media sites before they become radicalized. You see a lot of government action in these areas as well. That is actually smarter, much smarter than the mass collection.
Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, just two quick comments on that. Firstly, this discussion about kids, and it seems to me that while I agree with you, I need to play devil's advocate a bit here, right? If you look back at even some of the oldest cases of Datatilsynet, of the Norwegian Data Protection Inspectorate, since 1982, they've had applications for systems which would try to take corrective action of kids, for kids even built on the environment where they came, whether they've been placed into foster care, etc. And the Norwegians very quickly noticed, oh dear, this is going to be just like that film with Tom Cruise. What was it?
Minority Report.
Pardon?
Minority Report.
The Minority Report, right? That we're going to try and tackle kids even before they've ever committed any crime. So we have to keep that in touch. And also, something which I believe is in the spirit of what Gemma is saying, right? Apply the right tool to the right situation, right? Anybody who's tried to put up a picture on the wall and instead of using a hammer has used a sledgehammer knows what the result is like. And that is what I fear we're trying to do when it comes to privacy, right? If the French intelligence services has a problem which is between 11 and 20,000 suspects, the solution is not surely to carry out surveillance on all 70 million people. If the problem is that they only had 586 agents to keep tabs on them, hey, this is a wonderful opportunity to cut down unemployment in France, hire more Secret Service agents, and carry out targeted surveillance. I have absolutely nothing against properly targeted surveillance. It's when you carry out surveillance on those people who don't need it. So my suggestion is examine the problem properly. And if the solution, as Gemma said, is more police people, more Secret Service agents, more targeted surveillance on the right people, then that solution should be undertaken, even though it may not look as jazzy and as sexy as some other solutions that politicians go for.
Well, I want to pick up on something you said and talk about a little bit about the sort of the commercial element of this, because I'm plugging my own work again, but I did a report on the so-called Facebook arrests in Israel, where they used the authorities arrested primarily young Palestinian men for being terrorists. And the one shocking comment that was made by one of the chiefs of police was, well, they didn't know they were terrorists yet, but we worked out that they were based on what they were saying on Facebook. So, I mean, Minority Report is alive and well and in operation in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. But one of the things that was feeding into this was private companies selling them predictive software and really pushing them to use it. And I just wonder if that is an element of particular concern, because it's not being based on even politicians. You're very down on politicians, Joe, but some of them do try to do good work, and at least we do elect them, but we don't elect these private companies. So, I mean, Martin, do you want to react to that?
Well, let's think. I already talked too much, so maybe Leanne.
Leanne.
I mean, when it comes to this idea of you're going to predict whether someone is a criminal or not, I think there's definitely a very real concern that there is this idea that the technology is infallible. So for me, when we talk about this predictive policing thing, that's what resonates most with me, is that you put this great trust in the technology, and of course it can be inaccurate. And so again, I guess I keep going back to due process as being absolutely critical. And I just want to say that I didn't say the FRA is necessary and proportionate. I'll leave that to the European Court of Human Rights, who will soon make that decision. But what I have looked at in my research is the kind of due process tools that exist within Sweden that are extremely interesting, at least from an American perspective, where we don't have the same type of mechanisms, ombudsman, so on and so forth, foreign intelligence surveillance court that actually has some real power to look at the kind of selectors that are being used. I mean, so I guess for me, I'm a little bit realistic. Like, yeah, of course, bulk collection of data, let's not do that. But you know what? Every government in the world is actually doing it. So how can we, get lawmakers to get on board with some and here in Sweden we have seen the law be radically improved because there has been political pressure put on the members of the government here. So I just leave it there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I also wanted to ask a little quick question. I know I'm getting looks to say hurry up, we're nearly finished, I'm nearly out of time, about getting meaningful redress if there's always going to be a carve out for national security. I mean, how does that, do we want to close that loophole?
Well, don't even get me started on what is national carve out for national security mean. I mean, especially within European Union law. I mean, we know Article 4.2 of the Lisbon Treaty says no national security is outside the ambit of European law. But I mean, then of course we have all these other exceptions within the data protection directives. But yet we have private companies operating, handing over data to national security agencies, and they fall within the scope of European law. So I mean, what is national security in this context? And there's no definition anywhere.
Yeah, very quickly, 2 points. Firstly, just to build on the last point, we should be very careful not to confuse European law and EU law. All we have in Article 4.2 is that within the context of EU, that's the Europe of the 28, then you can't discuss it in Brussels. But basically, all the people inside the 28 are also inside the Europe of the 47, the Council of Europe, where they can discuss whatever they like, including national security, and nothing precludes them from doing that there, and they've done it. Convention 108, the European Data Protection Convention, already covers national security. The derogations in Article 9 cover national security. There's a whole load of national security which can be done if only we can find the political will for it. Secondly, to build on the resources argument and go to the United States, for example, if you look at one of the real reasons why we got FISA 702 in the United States, why we went from a system where you had a prior judicial authorization before you carry out surveillance to one where you only pre-authorize a system for carrying out surveillance, was human resources. If you look carefully at what the PCLOB, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, found in its report about the situation on FISA 702, it was precisely because they admitted there weren't enough human resources to examine the actual applications for carrying out surveillance. So in that case, if we can spend so many billions and have tens of thousands of agents out there doing the work, which, believe me, I thoroughly support if it's legitimate. Why can't we have, a couple of hundred or even 400 more judges, if that's what it's going to take, in order to examine the interception warrants, the surveillance warrants which are carried out? It's once again a matter of putting the right resources in the right way for the right solution. You do that in a measured manner, you get the right results which are fair all round, which achieve and increase security, but which also achieve and increase privacy. And that's why I'm so scared of simplistic solutions. Thank you.
Okay. Eric?
The more I hear you speak of mass surveillance, the more convinced I become of the effectiveness of predictive models, actually. That makes you don't need 400 judges, only maybe 20 if you pick the right persons in future. I think government, when it comes to redress, has to work in both ways. It has to make the surveillance systems, the predictive models more effective and better. And once that's also government obligatory. But also it has to evaluate and develop the non-discriminatory functions and the legality of the system. Government has to, and actually does in many cases in the best worlds, does both things and has to take a clear responsibility for both aspects.
Okay, Martin, final thought then before we wrap up.
Well, maybe a very, very simplistic and short thing would be that for people to be able to protect their privacy, they would need to know what it is and how they can protect it, and they don't. So people don't have knowledge of the rights, and they don't know how to go to the court, and they don't have the money for it either. So I think if we really want to boost privacy on that level, I think we need like targeted campaigns.
Okay, thank you very much, my entire panel.